Welcome to ROMECAST number 5 with myself, Father Dave Nix, and Andromeda. How you doing today, Andromeda?
I'm doing great, Father Nix. Thank you.
Just for our listeners, we're trying something new out. We're doing this number 5. We're doing it on Skype instead of my normal phone app. You guys can give us feedback as to how it sounds, but we'll just jump into Andromeda's story. Andromeda, what do you have for us today?
Well, I bumped across a story that was published in the New York Times about 3 days ago, and it's about Venezuela's meltdown, and a meltdown it is.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just start out with the quote that grasped me at first, and it's really in the first 2 paragraphs of the story. So Zimbabwe's collapse under Robert Mugabe, the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba's disastrous unraveling in the 1990s, the crumbling of Venezuela's economy has now outpaced all of them. Venezuela's fall is the single largest economic collapse outside of the war in at least 45 years, economists say. And that got me really excited that the New York Times is pointing this out, because as somebody who is, moderately well read in socialist, communist ideologies and being strongly against them, you sound in our current age, you start to sound like a conspiracy theory theorist.
Right.
When you start saying that socialism is bad, immediately, you have somebody point out, like, well, we're democratic socialist, or they'll just ignore the historical record on this. So to have this happen right now, I think in this really important time in American politics, which is, on the precipice of falling apart, it's great. It's a great talking point. So I want to thank the New York Times, first of all, for publishing it. It's brave of them. And I, in my view of being around kids, especially late high school, college, undergraduate, especially, I think they're lured into Marxist ideologies because at first glance, it seems to state in its propositions that it simply has the desire, the goal of freeing men from all suffering. And that sounds great. And then it describes what they propose, Marx, Engels, and then all of their, followers, that the root of suffering is really inequality, and then lay out a system.
Economic inequality.
Every kind of inequality, because even this gender ideology, the feminist, the kind of radical feminist ideas of like, we're so equal that there's no differences between men and women. I mean, you just like deny that there's any biological differences, any differences whatsoever. So that's not economic.
You're right. That's a good point, because that was exactly part of Marxism that we talked about, I think, in that first ROMECAST, was to level the playing field between men and women. Women had to go back to work and get on the contraceptive pill, and ultimately there was to be no difference between men and women. And I think this is exactly what Our Lady meant at Fatima, that Russia would spread her errors across the world.
That's right. That's right. And so, socialists, they don't want a system that will just make the world better. They want a system, and believe that they can achieve it through their programs, a world that is absolutely perfect. And so they won't, kind of back down on any of their tenets, because, it's an all or nothing situation. So this is a great quote from another article that was right before in the National Review. It says, if you tell a socialist that hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty in the last few decades by means of the very opposite system of socialism, he will immediately retort that millions of people have also not been lifted out of poverty. So for a true socialist, they're always going to focus on the person who hasn't. It doesn't matter if 10 years from now, half of the homeless population that exists right now is fully employed and home. Like, who cares about that? Because the other half still isn't. And their idea is really like, until everyone is lifted into a state of equality, then everybody should live in poverty.
Right.
Like, that's the equilibrium state. And until you have a system, so they'll argue like, oh well, it'll be bad for a little while, but we're sacrificing this.
Mhm.
You're gonna sacrifice this. We're not. The leaders of the revolution can't, because we need to distribute the goods. But
And so I haven't been following the news. What happened in Venezuela? I mean, obviously it's been a socialist leader down there. What's the news down there?
yeah, so the economic scene is one of like hyperinflation, like has never been seen, something like 10 million%.
Mm.
It's really ridiculous number. You have photos in this New York Times article of flea market vendors with bags of money for that
Mm.
people carry in, like garbage bag size bags
Yeah.
full of money to pay for, like tiny little items in a, shack, a flea market shack.
Yeah.
The money is worthless, absolutely worthless. I think a lot of people know that they lost electricity for an entire week, and of course the rule of law there has been completely demolished by, all the gangs, juntas, drug dealers have
Yeah.
taken over, local communities, and extracting whatever resources they can out of these already impoverished, locals. They can't live. I mean, it's just grinding poverty. There's another photo that's really powerful in this New York Times article of families like lined up to this. It looks like a dump yard, but there's I guess a little spring that runs through all of this garbage, and they're collecting water
Mm.
because there's no running water. I mean, the poverty right now is so extreme,
Yeah.
and it's subjecting tens of millions to a life that really is just not tenable, not even for a little while longer. And so I think the New York Times, having people down there, were at least moved by the poverty they saw to just see, to tell this story, because nobody has been telling and
Yeah.
showing this story except for, like small Catholic blogs,
Hmm.
people who have been down there or have family down there trying to tell this story, but largely being ignored. So
And your family
those are
fled from Vietnam because of communism, right?
well, yeah, I mean,
Or was it something else?
well, the war,
The war. Yeah.
but the war is, a result of, kind of communist ideology seeping into, well, taking hold of Vietnam,
Hmm.
and doing the same thing that all socialist systems, which I include communism in that, as they start
Yeah.
to take over little by little, sometimes a little bit faster, all the, kind of oil, water, all the natural resources. They
Yeah.
take them from private to public property. They start, and then you just see employment drop, and you see, kind of regime takeover of just all the normal daily
Yeah.
life of a family. You see in China, they control birth rates. They control, now you have a social system in China that you not a credit score, but you have a social scoring system, which is
Wow.
really, really terrible. If you haven't
Yeah.
seen this story it's in CNN, of the social credit system that they've just implemented. It basically, if if you haven't done certain things, or if you're seen doing certain things that are against party line, you lose social credit scores. And then they do things like project your name. You can't get buy houses. You can't do all of these things, not because you've been irresponsible with your finances, but because you have thought the wrong things.
Yes. That's actually a good segue into my whole section, because I noticed in the West, we have a social credit system for how much we line up with the party line in the Catholic Church. And I'm actually going to call this ROMECAST number 5, I'm going to call it Venezuela and Vatican II. And that's a little bit of a misleading title, because I'm not actually going to connect Vatican II to what's happening in Venezuela, whatever. It's just that you talked about Venezuela, and I'm going to talk about Vatican II. But the good segue is just this social credit system that I just keep noticing that anyone who's really a traditional or a conservative Catholic is kind of subjected to here in the West. And it's this whole chess game of proving obedience to these capricious decisions nowadays in the Catholic world, so that people who don't like us traditional or even conservative Catholics try to trip us up on an authority like they did to Jesus. So listen to Matthew 21, verses 23 to 27. And when Jesus entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" Jesus answered them, "I also will ask you one question, and if you tell me the answer, then I also will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, from where did it come? From heaven or from men?" And they discussed it among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say to us, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But if we say from man, we are afraid of the crowd, for they all hold that John was a prophet." So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." That's Matthew 21. But today the questions of the Inquisition we always get put through, they all sound like this, or are exactly these questions. Do you believe in Vatican II? Are you schismatic? Do you think Pope John Paul II is a saint? And I get these questions almost any time I teach the Catholic faith, quoting anything before 1950, even if what I'm quoting is not controversial, but just old school in its teaching. And I used to try to answer those questions, but here's my new attitude. It's this: I'm not going to be put on trial for teaching what the Church has always taught. So I flip it and I make them answer, did Vatican II change the Catholic faith? Now, liberal modernists will say, yes, Vatican II changed the faith. And my answer to them is easy, but the Catholic faith can't change, so you're following something different than what Christ gave to the apostles. But the funny thing is that liberals admit that their Catholic faith changed completely, and they don't care. So they're not too fun to debate. But the conservative modernists, people like George Weigel, well, these are more fun to deal with, because they will inevitably answer my question like this: no, Vatican II did not change the Catholic faith. You see, they hold to the Pope John Paul II idea of Vatican II, that it did not change the dogma delivered to the people, only the packaging. Okay, fine. But then, because they're correct that Vatican II was a pastoral council, not a dogmatic council, I could go down that road, but I actually don't go down that road. So here's a kicker. When a conservative modernist challenges me on my view of Vatican II, I just ask them if Vatican II changed the Catholic faith. Again, they invariably and triumphantly say no. So my new resolution is to simply say, and listeners, listen closely, because after all this hemming and hawing, this is the key part that will help you. I say, or my new resolution is to say, great, then there should be no problem with me teaching what the Catholic faith has always taught. So to summarize, when someone asks you, do you believe in Vatican II, or are you schismatic, or do you think Pope John Paul II is a saint? Just flip it and just say, do you think Vatican II changed the faith? If they say yes, then say, well, then you're wrong, because God can't change. But if they say no, as probably most of the friends of listeners out there are going to hear from their friends, and just say, great, then there should be no problem with me teaching what the Catholic faith has always taught. And or you could be more specific. There should be no problem with me promoting the Tridentine Mass or Tridentine theology, or really it's the Gregorian Mass from the 6th century at the latest, or patristic theology. But the main line to remember is, great, then there should be no problem with me teaching what Christ and the Catholic faith has always taught. So that's my new resolution, to not enter into their inquisition, but just to flip it.
That's great. I was thinking while you were talking about that yes, people have kind of approached me with questions similar to that. Most of them have been around the liturgy, like, oh, do you think the Novus Ordo is, a valid mass? Do you, those kinds of questions.
Because you go to Latin Mass.
because they noticed that I started attending the Latin Mass,
Yeah.
And they could see that that was happening. It was visible. The
Yeah.
other thing that was very well, the way it became visible to my friends who were in my parish was I started I was still going to the Novus Ordo. But now, I decided I had to wear a chapel veil because the idea was, well, it is the same, like that's
Mm.
Jesus. And if I had to cover my head when I was, with Jesus over here, then obviously I have to
Right.
cover my head when I'm with Jesus over here.
Funny
And so I
they
started wearing a veil.
funny the breakdown happens when you insist on that.
Yeah, yeah. And then that progressed into receiving communion on the tongue. So it was more of these visible cues that I, you know,
Well, and
I
I think
started
you told me you
displaying. Yeah.
weren't really welcome when you started doing those two things. I mean,
It was
it,
very, very clear that I was doing the wrong thing when I
mm,
came back.
wrong in quotes, of
And
course. Yeah.
wrong in quotes. And
Yeah.
and so without even saying so much or having discussions, I could see, you know, from the, Eucharistic ministers, they
Yeah.
were really afraid of what was happening to me. They expressed some fear about it.
Sure. No, and I think, this is where I think Pope Benedict XVI, his whole project was the hermeneutic of continuity, and God bless him. I think he's a good pope, and I think he's a good man, but I think the hermeneutic of continuity is at least practically failed. And he's a very, very he was a slash is he is a very intellectual man, and his idea of the hermeneutic of continuity, that we have to take pre and post council theology and liturgy and meld them together because they're both mutually leavened to each other. What's so funny is practically at the very beginning, everyone's for this, and then somehow their conscience just works on them. Like, I'm sure the priest was totally okay at the beginning with you having your veil on at the Novus Ordo and receiving Holy Communion kneeling on your tongue at the beginning, because we like diversity and we like the hermeneutic of continuity. But really, what is it that rubs on their conscience that eventually is just so convicting to people? And they might say, oh, because you're following something in the medieval ages, and we're trying to bring all this back to the simple faith of the early church. Well, the Bible says women should cover their heads in church. So clearly this was done from the very, very first century onwards. And, where does this hermeneutic of continuity begin? And it really begins and ends in these convicted consciences, to tell you the truth.
Yes, yeah, it really does. And I think that's been my whole experience because I walked very slowly towards learning more and more about tradition, through the saints, and then eventually through the liturgy. And I never had a spirit of rebellion against what I was already part of.
Yeah.
I thought all I was doing was becoming more and more Catholic. Like I was just
Hmm.
becoming more fervent, and that's all. It's like I want to be as Catholic as I can be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I didn't see that as problematic. That everybody wasn't following along with me. I just,
Right.
I was just like, some people, can, they have um, the life circumstances that allow them to sit in adoration for longer. I
Yeah.
never saw it
Yeah.
as a point of rebellion. I
Yeah.
didn't know I was a rebel until I
Yeah.
was told I was.
Yeah. Well, you're
um,
not, and you're not, and
no,
that's
I'm
the thing
not.
is, like,
That's right.
yeah. But I think there's a lot of people like you out there. I mean, I'm I'm in the same category, because even though I'm a revert and you're a convert, we both tried to make it happen as best we could in the Novus Ordo world without being rebellious. We were just doing that, and then slowly people let us know that interpreting the Mass and the rules of Vatican II, even according to post-Vatican II rules, was not to be permitted, even in conservative parishes. And I think that as more and more people wake up to this, more and more people are just saying, well, if there's this gray zone of this sliding scale that I have to constantly maneuver around, I might as well pick black or white. And then they go with white and they go to the traditional Latin Mass. So the funny thing is, it's all just getting sifted out entirely. And I think that one good thing about where we are in the church crisis is all the good and the bad's boiling to the top. The church is becoming extremely polarized. And I don't mean all listeners have to go to the Latin Mass to be good Catholics out there, because I know there's very holy people at the Novus Ordo, but I'm just making an empirical observation that there's a lot of people like you and me who tried to make it happen and didn't find a place because just some people had their consciences convicted. I mean, I can almost understand people getting mad
Yeah.
at me. You know, I would chase anybody when I was doing the Novus Ordo. Anyone who walked away with the Eucharist, I'd go chasing after them. I could understand people being mad at me for that, but you just being with a veil and receiving Holy Communion on the tongue, it's interesting that even you got some talkings to after Mass.
Yes, and what I was going to say is, really it was, had the hermeneutic of continuity, um, manifested itself,
Hmm.
in the
Hmm.
Novus Ordo communities that I were a part of, um, in the form of, like, had I gone to Holy Communion, received Holy Communion, kneeled, and it was no problem, I probably would have
Mm.
left the kind of by ritual
Yeah,
experience.
right. That's a great way to put it.
I probably would have continued because it was much easier to go to
Yeah,
mass when I didn't have to drive 60 minutes to go.
that's right.
And as a daily mass attender, this is like a burden. It's a
Yeah,
huge burden. And I
yeah,
did not want to make that decision. But if I couldn't receive Holy Communion kneeling, I couldn't, my
yeah.
heart was breaking, so I couldn't keep doing it.
No, and
And
as I told you, I'm
yeah.
visiting my grandma in a nursing home, and luckily this nice nursing home in Illinois has some downstairs guest rooms, and my grandma's upstairs. So I'm in a downstairs guest room. My grandma's upstairs. She's 103 years old, and I gave her the extreme unction and apostolic pardon. But down here, maybe I'll make this the featured image for the Facebook, or not the Facebook, since we're not putting on Facebook. The featured image for the blog/podcast is I have a full traditional Latin Mass kit set up on a card table from a nursing home down here. And there's been a couple times I've been bitter, like, oh man, this really stinks. I'm offering the traditional Latin Mass on a card table when I could be in a parish if I had just been a little less annoying and priests had been a little bit more hip on the hermeneutic of continuity. But then in my happier moments, maybe after a cup of coffee today, I'm like, but you know what? But I'm doing the Latin Mass, and I love that. And it's like, what you hear at the beginning of Divine Liturgy, they sing, "We have found the true faith." And I guess
Mm.
if it weren't for the pain of having been birthed and plopped out, like, how does Paul put it, an untimely miscarriage, kind of plopped out, I wouldn't have this. So would I rather be on a really beautiful altar doing the Novus Ordo and seeing people receive Holy Communion in the hands and walk away, or totally alone with God and millions of angels and saints on a card table? Well, I mean, I think 4 years ago I would have said it's a wash, and even though I'm not super content with my situation, I have my faculties, I'm a priest, I just gave my grandma the sacraments, and I get to do the Latin Mass, even if it's on a card table. So, these are weird days of kind of, well, I wouldn't put myself in this category, but I'll say this: there are plenty of white martyr priests out there doing their masses on card tables. I don't know if I'd put myself as one of those, but anyway, we're all getting birthed into truth and tradition in some very odd ways. Some people became traditionalists because they're just Protestant in their mindset, and they want to be rebels, and they want to be angry, and they want to be, they just want to find a problem in the church. Where others of us really tried to make it happen as best we could with the
That's right.
conciliar church, and then they're the ones who insisted there's no hermeneutic of continuity. I mean, I joke, but I'm serious. It's not the liberals who convinced me there's no hermeneutic of continuity. It's actually the conservative non-traditionalists who convinced me there is no hermeneutic of continuity. Now, Christ is still with his church, of course, but I think the Lord's letting us all this stuff bubble to the top for people to really make clear decisions at this point.
That's been my experience. And I just add, like, on a very small scale, I understand the problem, for priests who are trying to remain Orthodox in a very,
Hmm.
very confusing situation. As a layperson, me kneeling for Holy Communion, at the moment of Holy Communion, having like an argument with the priest that I'm going to take
Right.
communion on the tongue, that is the furthest thing, as somebody who wanted to be more and more Catholic, wanted
Yeah.
to experience, because I have
Yeah.
such a love for the priesthood. It's really something that I pray about and for
Oh, I know you
all the
do.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it broke my heart really to ever be in that situation where I would make a priest feel angry, at the
Yeah.
moment of Holy Communion. This was just,
Yeah.
and really it was experiences like that I said, oh, I
Gave you no
can't
other
do
option.
that.
Yeah,
That gave me no option.
you didn't want
Yeah.
to be a troublemaker at a
I
peaceful moment.
didn't,
Yeah.
exactly. I did
Yeah.
not want to be that person. I
Yeah.
didn't want to be a troublemaker.
Yeah.
That's not what I wanted to be. Yeah.
Well,
But
and last thing I'll say about this, once
yeah.
Bishop Bunini, who wrote the new mass, he actually wrote that he wanted every single parish in a diocese to have kind of a different mass or flavor or style from the next parish. He wanted every pastor's personality to be the determinant of that parish's specific mass. In other words, what Bishop Bonini wrote for the new mass was that every parish would be different from the next parish, and it's like mission accomplished. But then someone like
Yes, yeah.
but someone like you who learned the Catholic faith through books and thought it was uniform, then you go and like one Novus Ordo priest thinks you're great for having the veil. The next one thinks you're a distraction, and it's funny. The arguments are always human-centered instead of God-centered. The argument that lay people always told me that they would hear from priests when they would kneel at the Novus Ordo to receive Holy Communion, if the priest denied him that, they always said someone's going to trip. Isn't that interesting? It has nothing to do with bending the knee before the God of the universe, but someone behind you might trip. Now, first of all, I've never ever heard of anyone tripping, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's funny. It's always a man-centered argument instead of, concern of God. Like, does God have any rights in any of these debates at all, or is it just, the fact that someone maybe 8 years ago in Arkansas tripped because someone kneeled? It's just you can't argue with these people. So you just got to go find it where you can
Yeah,
be found.
and honestly, you don't want to. That was not the
Exactly.
purpose of,
No.
going on a Sunday to receive Christ in Holy Communion, was to
No way.
start World War II.
No, and that's
Yeah,
not why I got ordained. And that's why I
that's
only do the
right.
Latin Mass now, is because, people think I got in this to start fights with people and stuff, and it's like,
No.
no, I just want to be Catholic, not traditional Catholic,
Yeah.
not mean Catholic, not conservative Catholic. I just want to be
Amen.
Catholic. And if people won't accept that, I'll go do Mass on a card table. So it's okay. It's okay. Life goes,
Yeah, yeah.
and
Yeah, it's a matter of conscience, and
it's conscience has to come first. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and I think even the mainstream church structure talks a lot
Yeah.
about conscience. So it's amazing
That's
that
right.
when
Isn't that
somebody is
funny?
convicted by conscience, yeah.
Yeah, it's like that's if that's the number one determinant for the postmodern view of moral theology, then I'll claim it all day long.
Yeah.
I'm going to let Andromeda run, but we're still going to jump into the life of the Blessed Virgin Mary by a 7th century doctor of the Church, St. Maximus the Confessor, translated by Shoemaker. This is chapter 19, the Annunciation. And in the 6th month after Elizabeth's conception, the archangel Gabriel was sent by God to the city of Nazareth to the house of Joseph, and he announced to the Virgin Mary the glorious and wonderful Annunciation, ineffable and incomprehensible, the foundation and beginning of all good things. And when, how, and where did the Annunciation take place? The Virgin was fasting and standing in prayer near a fountain, because she conceived the fountain of life, Psalm 35:10. It was in the 1st month, when God also had created the whole world, in order to show us that now he renews the old world again. It was the 1st day of the week, which is Sunday, on which day he dispelled the primeval darkness and created the primordial light, and on which day the glorious resurrection of her King and Son from the grave took place, along with the resurrection of our nature. And not only was it the 1st day, but the 1st hour, according to the saying of the prophet, God will help her in the morning, Psalm 45:6. Such then were the words of the archangel, and how full they were with mystery. Rejoice, favored one, Luke 1:28. Rejoice was spoken for the destruction of the original sadness and the harsh judgment, and on account of the new grace that now had been given to human understanding, and favored one because of the virgin's wealth of virtue and the grace that had come upon her. And like a dowry, this first thing was the engagement of the immortal bridegroom and the destruction of the original curse that came upon us through the disobedience and error of our original mother. And instead of woeful sadness, the gift of eternal joy. And the second thing was an indication of the wealth of the unwedded bride. Both of these things the archangel proclaimed. Then he added, "The Lord is with you." Luke 1:28. This is the entire wealth of the King. It is the fulfillment of his promise. The Word of God himself, by the Word beyond all words, entered into the womb of the Holy Virgin. He united himself with humanity not through seed, but by the power of the Most High and the coming of the Holy Spirit. He himself was the one who united and the one who was united. He united the two natures in one hypostasis and was united with human nature by grace. He built the temple of his flesh himself as he saw fit. Nevertheless, these same words, "the Lord is with you," were also the destruction and annihilation of the primordial curse that had been placed on women. For man had been appointed the Lord of woman, and woman's recourse to man had been commanded, Genesis 3:16, and childbirth was established with pain and affliction because of the original disobedience, as the prophet bears witness, as when the pain of childbirth arrives at the time of birth, she cries out from the pain, Isaiah 26:17. In this way, then, there was no end to the servitude and pain and affliction of women. But when the archangel said to the Holy Virgin, "The Lord is with you," all the debts of affliction were erased. The Lord is with you, and there is no longer the lordship of man over you, nor the pain of childbirth, for truly she alone is a virgin exalted above all virgins, a virgin ever immaculate, before birth, in birth, and after birth. And not only was the grace of perpetual virginity given to her, but from that time forward she became the foundation of virginity for other women, and by her the ability was given to women who wished to be virgins. Before this, women were not able to be virgins, but the beloved and most blessed, ever virgin Theotokos Mary became the foundation and cause of virginity for women who desire it. For in fact she also became the cause and source of every good thing for men and women, the glorious and all-holy Mother of the Lord and God and our Savior Jesus Christ, the ornament of human nature, the song and joy of the angels, intercessor for humanity, and aid to all the faithful. Thanks for joining us on ROMECAST 5. God bless you.